And welcome to the Enthus 360 webinar. This one is titled Privacy 101. And this webinar will give a foundational element to both privacy and technology that's associated with privacy via our friends at WireWheel. As we go through this, we will have the ability to ask questions via the Q&A function, or towards the end, to be able to raise your hand also. So next slide, please. Housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. By remaining online, you consent to be recorded. That is a privacy notice of sort, and we'll talk a little more about that in a little bit. If you have any questions, you can enter the questions in the chat function. We have a couple of folks monitoring the chat function in case Trevor and I miss a chat or a question. And at the end of the event, we'll also give you the ability to raise your hand, and then one of our folks will be able to unmute your microphone. Next. So I just want to talk about Advyz for a second. So Enthus 360 has been in business since about 1988. We have 600-700 clients, most of them on the West Coast. Advyz has been around with Enthus now for about 18 months, and it is a cyber practice that is staffed with highly experienced cyber professionals. And as part of that, we're also rolling out a privacy program. And while it may sound like we're just beginning a privacy program, the reality is myself and others associated with privacy have been around privacy for a large number of years and have served clients from Fortune 100, Fortune 500 across all the different industries. So the reality is that what our focus is helping organizations come from an immature privacy state to a mature privacy state, make any changes that are associated with new regulatory environments, and ensure that they stay up to date to create a defensible position or posture. And what I mean by defensible position or posture is, should you be audited or assessed or inspected by either a client or a regulatory body, our goal is to ensure that you can defend what you're doing from a privacy and security perspective. And when I say security, I'm specifically talking about the protection of personally identifiable information. So our practice really begins at the top with privacy regulation monitoring, policy and procedure development, and then goes all the way down into the program creation and the operationalization and ongoing monitoring and audit across all of these different domains. So that is who we are, what we do from a privacy perspective, and we work in concert with our technology cohorts inside Enthus, as well as partnering and affiliating with outside leading technology providers, one of which you're going to hear today. Next slide. So who the heck am I? So I'm Robert Glaser. I've been with Enthus now for about 6 months. Prior to Enthus was with Deloitte for about 8.5 years in their global privacy practice. Prior to that, I was a chief privacy officer of 3 different biopharmaceutical firms, and no, I didn't get fired. I kept getting caught up in mergers and acquisitions. So I began doing privacy in about 2003. I figure I personally have served over 150 different clients over the past several years, most of whom were in the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, but also some were very small family-owned businesses. So it really depends upon the complexity of the organization. So I tell people I was doing privacy before privacy was cool. When I first joined the International Association of Privacy Professionals, there were fewer than 500 people there who were members. There are now over 50,000. And prior to my time as a privacy professional, I was a health information executive, i.e. a chief information officer in healthcare, both inside the military and outside the military. Trevor, going to turn it over to you and let you talk about who you are for just a sec.
Thanks, Robert. So hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Hellebuyck. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at WireWheel. I've spent really the vast majority of my career, over 23 years, in and around the software space, specifically building software technology organizations. So I'm a developer and architect by trade, and hopefully I bring a little bit of a different view of the world from an engineering perspective with regard to some of the privacy challenges that organizations are facing on a day-to-day basis. For those of you that aren't familiar with WireWheel, WireWheel is a leading SaaS provider of technology solutions that help organizations become compliant quickly. And when we talk about compliance, we're talking about things like GDPR, CCPA, et cetera. So a lot of the challenges that we're going to talk about today in this 101 session are going to be directly related to some of the solutions and capabilities that WireWheel brings to market to help organizations become compliant from a privacy perspective.
Great. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about the evolving privacy landscape as well as corporate privacy program development and engineering privacy at scale. And that's the nuance of difference. So let me just set this up for a second here. The reality is many of us in the privacy space or who are associated with the privacy space have been privacy 101 to death. So I'm hoping that some people on this call are new to privacy, that we are bringing a different dynamic to the conversation as a privacy 101, meaning a technology perspective that is of interest to many of the technology folks who are on this call. And also the other purpose of this call is to set the groundwork, because WireWheel and Enthus together have another 6 different webinars planned, one for each of the next 6 months. And we needed to set a baseline to make sure everybody was at the same starting point. So today we're going to kind of talk about the global privacy landscape, the US privacy landscape, global corporate privacy program development, some of the nuances of that. But we're really going to try and focus on and feature Trevor and the WireWheel guys to talk about engineering privacy at scale. So I appreciate everybody joining this. For those of you that have heard Privacy 101 before, this is a good refresher. And for those of you that have never heard about privacy engineering, this is going to be a great session, and I look forward to hearing from Trevor. Next slide, please. So we have to do the normal disclaimers. This isn't my or Trevor's official policy or position for our employers. We have no interest or affiliation with the corporate organization that we may mention in this. This information does not provide legal, accounting, or tax advice. It the information may be applicable or suitable for your circumstances or not. We urge you to talk to your providers, your legal folks, and your privacy or technology professionals. And of course, Trevor and I have zero liability or responsibility to any person, entity, or corporation. But the reality is we're here to provide information and not guidance. The reality is we are both very happy to interface or to talk to participants following this presentation to learn, who would like to learn more, run workshops, have discussions, etc. Next slide. So we're going to run some polling questions. We have 3 polling questions throughout this particular presentation. This will be number 1. The reality is that you have live ability to enter your answer to the polling question, and then we will show you the results. So how many states in the US have an active privacy law either passed or in development? There are 35 people on this presentation and about 11 responses. 13. We're getting closer. All right, I think we're good. All right, so the answer is 6+. Well, it really depends, and we're going to go into this in a little bit, how you are defining an active privacy law. There is an active privacy law. Many of us have heard of the California Consumer Privacy Act. That's an active privacy law. But all 50 states have a data breach law. And all 50 states have specific information that is contained within their data breach law, which is generally Social Security name, number, bank account information, government issued identifiers, health status, those types of things. So if you're talking about data breach, it's all 50 states. If you're talking about privacy law, it's really about 6 or 6+. And I'll show you these in a few minutes. But to give you an example, California has innumerable privacy laws. That's one state, but it has innumerable privacy laws. Ditto Texas, ditto Colorado. So let's move on to the next item, and we'll talk a little bit about this. All right, so I'm going to start this and then move it over to Trevor. But why is legislation needed? And that's really an interesting title. But the reality is why do regulators think that privacy legislation is needed? And so what we are seeing, particularly because the US does not have an overarching privacy law, is states are beginning to take the lead in moving the privacy laws forward. The second thing is that data breaches are increasing. And as an example, I myself have received 8 data breach notifications in the past 12 months. And if you take data breach A and combine it with data breach B, then they can tell about everything there is to know about me. Businesses are being impacted. The global cost of a data breach is increasing. The number of breaches is increasing. The fines associated with data breaches are increasing. One resource that you can go to is the Ponemon Institute, Ponemon, and they will be, they have a number of research studies, one of which is cost of data breach. But the big thing here is it's not only financial harm, but it's reputational harm. So if you look, share of US consumers who would hold a company responsible for loss of personal data is 64%. And there's also a number of people who would leave your company if they had the opportunity to do so if they didn't trust you. So this is really why the legislation's coming about. Trevor, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, just real quickly, I think this is a trend that's obviously going to continue. You're going to see the number of breaches and the number of records exposed via breaches increase, and a lot of that has to do with the increasing number of attack vectors available. Hackers are very creative, and they're constantly creating new ways to be able to breach these systems and access the data. And that's obviously compounded by the fact that there's the trend that's been occurring really over the last 10, 15, even 20 years, where successful businesses tend to be data-driven businesses, and businesses are collecting larger and larger volumes of data that include significant amounts of personal information or personally identifiable information.
Yeah, and if there were some recently, I think in the past week, 2 weeks, there were some articles out there that were talking about the number of companies held for ransomware that have actually been paying the ransom. So it's really interesting because there are no alternatives to paying the ransom unless you were talking about the loss of data. And just because you pay a ransom doesn't mean you're actually going to get access back to your data. And of course, now the US government has actually recovered some of the money paid on one of the recent ransomware attacks. So it's very interesting. But in healthcare, the ransomware has significant legal and operational implications, not unlike whether it be an energy company or something, except it's much more personal to the health of the individual. And so we're seeing a number of healthcare entities pay the ransom. So all of these things, like Trevor talked about, are pretty significant of late. Next slide. So global privacy regulations are increasing. And this slide comes from DLA Piper, Global Data Protection Laws. You can go to that particular website and you'll see this slide comes up. And the nice thing about that website is it also allows you to compare, say, country A to country B across different domains, such as breach reporting, federal privacy law, consent, notice, choice, things of that nature. I will tell you, though, that just because Europe is red, the United States and Canada are red, does not mean that the intensity of regulation or the strictness of regulation is exactly the same, nor does this slide convey culture. So if you go back to World War II, people were persecuted, prosecuted, put to death, put in jail for things like race, ethnic origin, political affiliation, trade union membership, health status, sexual orientation, criminal history. Those are very, very important to Europeans. And consequently, their laws at the federal level really reflect that. Now, Europe restricts the movement of data outside for European residents outside of Europe only to countries that have been designated as providing adequate protections for personal data and or entities that have put additional controls in place, such as model contract clauses, such as binding corporate rules. And a lot of this is in fluff because of some recent court cases. So the US has a lot of laws, Europe has a lot of laws, but the nuances of data transfer are much different. And as we talk about a global economy and the fact that Europe has designated the US as a country that provides inadequate protections, you have to think about this from the perspective of implementing your global privacy program. Next slide, please. Inside the US, because the federal government has not implemented a federal level privacy law, many states are beginning to take matters into their own hands. And so there's a saying in privacy that is, where Europe goes, the rest of the world follows, except for the US. And in the US, where California goes, the rest of the US goes. So there actually, were 5-6 months ago, were conversations where Europe was actually considering making California a jurisdiction where data transferred from Europe to California could be, that adequacy decision could be determined to be adequate, whereas the rest of the US is not the same. We asked the polling question earlier, how many states have active privacy laws? I mentioned the fact that all 50 states have data breach laws, but we now have California, we now have Virginia, we now have Nevada, we now have Colorado. And so these types of laws are beginning to continue to move forward inside the state legislators. And whether you be a technologist who supports privacy or a privacy professional, the reality is that maintaining the knowledge that is associated with the nuances of 50 states and territories legislation, plus global legislation such as Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, India, China, and of course the European Union, all changes, and consequently there is a role of expertise that has evolved over the last 20 years. So the International Association of Privacy Professionals contains a US state privacy legislation tracker. It's updated around the 10th or 11th of every month, and it is kept current. And the articles that go along with this are crazy detail and are wonderful in terms of the oversight and the impact. But my point being, privacy that used to be a sideline for a lot of companies now is a full-time real profession, not unlike what Y2K did for the position of CIO. Next slide. So different approaches to privacy. The European Union takes a comprehensive approach. I mentioned some of the foundational elements like World War II earlier, meaning that the law encompasses all industries and member states. So they have the General Data Protection Regulation, and it doesn't matter what industry or what member state you are in, you have to follow the regulation. Before the regulation, they had a directive, which meant that each member state could implement the directive as they saw fit. The regulation standardizes, for the most part, the implementation of the requirements of the General Data Protection Regulation. We in the US, on the other hand, tend to take a sector-based approach. And what I mean by that is you can have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act for healthcare. You can have Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, for financial services. And you can also have state laws, and we mentioned things such as the California Consumer Data Protection Act, the Virginia Data Protection Act, Colorado, et cetera. In Europe, the cultural difference here on the top is that in Europe, you are loaning your personal information to an entity for a specified purpose based on notice, choice, and consent. In the US, prior to the advent of CCPA, most companies would collect the information and your expectation would be that they would use it in accordance with law. So this is in the transition, but that's one of the nuances of difference. In APAC, we're beginning to see many more comprehensive laws. I mean, you can see Hong Kong, Singapore. China, of course, has just passed a law. Implementing privacy inside Hong Kong and China requires a whole different level of expertise. And that expertise can be very problematic because of some of their data security laws. In Latin America, we're beginning to see many countries starting, or some legacy, Argentina as an example, have very comprehensive laws, some more recent, such as Brazil. The same thing, though, is we're beginning to see federal overarching laws. So we in the United States, it's not in our Bill of Rights, there is no right of privacy. We in the United States do not have a federal overarching law, but Korea does, Japan does, the European Union does, and most countries in Latin America that have implemented a law have implemented a law at the federal level. So we in the United States are kind of an outlier. And we have, therefore, the complexity of the United States is different than the complexity of the rest of the world. And that's, again, why people like me have a job. Next, please. So, look, there are a lot of different pieces of legislation that are protected. And some of these pieces, a lot of pieces of data that are protected. Some of these require higher levels of control. So if your company has a data classification program, if your company has a data destruction program, most of the companies I've worked with, they have 5 levels of classification, and privacy tends to be, personal data tends to be in 3, 4, and 5, the 3 highest levels depending upon the sensitivity. So we have regulated and unregulated data, and we have evolving definitions. California, as an example, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, says anything that can identify you directly or indirectly or something about you or your family. So if you think about smart meters, they can tell when you come and go. You think about your toll tags, they can tell when you go through, you travel through a particular toll booth. Think about the GPS in your car. Those were indirect forms of identification that historically were never managed by regulation. So I mentioned a while ago that Europe really focuses on the second part, the sensitive data, health, status, sexual orientation, political affiliation, trade union membership, criminal history, things of that nature. And then what we have in the US is what we would call other forms of regulated information. So that may be Social Security number, would be government issued identifiers, bank account information, credit card numbers, PIN codes. That's your level 5. What I just mentioned, the sensitive data plus the other forms of data is the level 5. But when I go in, I talk to companies, I say, do you collect sexual orientation? And they will say, oh, no, we don't. And I said, I'll bet you do because you offer same-sex benefits and you can tell that Joe has Mike on their benefit program. Or do you collect salary? What does everybody have in your benefits department have access to salary? And they'll say, no. I said, well, the reality is if you know you provide 3 times your base salary as your life insurance benefit, then you can infer salary. So this is where people like me operate in a world of paranoia, meaning it's not what is, it's what could be. So again, we have the classification of a level 5, which is sensitive and regulated information. Then you have level 4, which is what I call more specific information. And I would put things like salary, benefits, those types of things in there. And then you have general business contact information or personal contact information. I would put that in level 3. For the most part, I would never put anything related to personal data in a level below level 3. And most personal data sits in a level 4 and 5 on a 5 scale, with 5 being the strictest. Next slide, please.
Robert, we actually have a question that came in. What is the likelihood of a federal data privacy law passing, and what might that look like?
I'm smiling because I've had that question asked of me at least since 2008 and 2009. So first of all, industry is lobbying the government to have a preemption clause, which says that the federal law preempts state law because industry is having trouble keeping up with the state requirements. The states, on the other hand, are lobbying the federal government to say, not unlike HIPAA, HIPAA sets a floor, but it doesn't set a ceiling. So states are free to implement stricter laws related to health information privacy than HIPAA, and California and Texas particularly have done that. I give the likelihood in the Democratic administration 40 or 50% maybe. There are a number of priorities in the Biden administration that are on a higher level, and we will just have to see. I'm of the mind that we will see it when it happens, and we will believe it when it happens, but I'm at the 40 or 50% level.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so corporate privacy program development. So what are we going to talk about here? Well, the first thing we'll do is do a polling question. Who within your organization owns privacy? And when I say owns, what I'm really talking about is the single point of contact or the one-stop shop or the buck stops here type person. Got about 13 of 38. And just for the record, I know a lot of us are in Zoom burnout, and I appreciate the attendance today. All right, I think we're good. So when I started with Deloitte in 2000, well, let me say, prior to my time with Deloitte, and I am not an attorney, I was in the legal department, the healthcare compliance department, and the corporate compliance department. Historically, privacy has been located in legal or compliance. And what we saw around 2013, 2014 was a shift out of legal into compliance. Legal has a role because their role is to interpret law, but we saw that because privacy is a risk mitigation strategy, we saw a shift into compliance, not unlike fair trade, not unlike foreign corrupt practices. Privacy was in many cases put into the compliance department. In companies that are not larger, we see a lot of privacy sitting in IT. So 16%, I would have guessed 20, so that's about right. Multiple departments, we are seeing either where there's a hybrid privacy program that's not run by one person, or where privacy has been culturally integrated throughout the organization, then we are seeing multiple departments responsible for privacy. And I don't know, generally means that privacy has not been well integrated into the culture of the organization, and there is no single orchestra conductor, as I would refer to it. So this is not a surprise, and I think that this is an adequate reflection of what we still find in industry today. When we talk about a maturity model, and Trevor will go through this a little bit towards the end of his presentation, what we're really talking about are, first of all, what are the components, and then what's the status? So generally, there are 7 key considerations that go along with a mature privacy program. One is risk. Organizations first must consider risk. And historically, organizations have considered financial harm. Now they're considering reputational harm. 2, what are the customers and who are your customers and what are your customer expectations? And not only your customers, but the business relationships. Are your business relationships demanding privacy of you? Are you taking care of privacy and security because of mergers and acquisitions? And if so, what kind of technologies do you have? The increased use of things such as cloud technologies or the implementation of privacy enhancing or privacy enabling technologies, such as what Trevor's company does. Use of cookies and tracking. Many of you have probably recently updated your iPhones, and all of a sudden you see that you have to defer to the tracking permissions now on your iPhone. This is all part of technology enablement of privacy. Of course, we have globalization. I talked about some of that a while ago. Different regions, different jurisdictions have different expectations. Same thing with employee data. Even in California, the employee data is a couple of years. The requirement to comply with CCPA is a couple of years behind the requirement to comply with CCPA for consumer data. So different jurisdictions have different requirements. They have different requirements related to email monitoring, tracking, and collection of data. And then, of course, the changes in regulation are all impacting us all across the board. So these are the components that you have to consider as you begin to implement. Next slide, please. Different domains, and the domains that we generally work with are things like governance, notice, choice, consent, data subject rights, security. All of these domains have to be implemented and have to be internalized in some way, shape, or form in order to mature your privacy program. Next slide. And you all can get copies of these slides. Avoid the disconnect, cross-border transfers, legalized, legalese type confusing privacy notices, a good breach reporting program that is exercised. And then, of course, data subject rights, such as the right to be forgotten or the right to access your data. That's huge. And one of the reasons also the gaining access is why we're beginning to see changes in the HIPAA rule set. And then lastly, I think I have one additional slide. And that, the next slide, please. I'm going to let Trevor take it from here. And basically, what we've moved through is why privacy, what are the components, what are the needs, and what's the maturation. And I know we're already, because I talk a lot, running short on time, so I'm going to let Trevor just jump right in here.
Thanks, Robert. As you can see, Robert's a wealth of knowledge on the subject. So what I'll talk to you real quick about is engineering privacy at scale. And in order to do that, I want to set up the conversation by talking a little bit about some of the conflicts, internal conflicts that typically happen within an organization between privacy professionals and engineering professionals, which I think if a lot of folks from the engineering side are participating in this webinar today, we'll kind of understand some of these challenges. Next slide. But first, we're going to start off with a quick polling question. So the question is, how would you rate your team's privacy maturity? We'll give folks a minute to respond. And Robert, if you will, I can't see the number of responses on my end, so I'll defer to you when we feel like we have enough responses.
Yeah, we have about 11 out of 36 right now. A few more. Give it about another 5 seconds, Trevor. We have 14 of 30 attendees. All right, we have 16 of 30.
Okay.
We're good.
Yeah, and I think the responses here are pretty consistent with what we'd expect. A lot of folks still kind of in that ad hoc or defined phase, and reaching towards more mature privacy processes. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute and why that matters. Next slide, please. Okay, so to kind of set the stage for the conversation, there's actually a really fantastic blog post that was written by Elisa Bergman, who's the Chief Privacy Officer at Adobe, and was published on the IAPP blog site called "If Privacy Principles Are from Venus, Then Engineering Rules Are from Mars." And this is really a fantastic primer on the subject, which really sets up this dichotomy between privacy principles and guidelines and versus kind of the engineering view of the world. So in the privacy world, things tend to be a bit more flexible. The contexts are unstable. Obviously, as Robert pointed out, the privacy landscape is fluid and ever changing, where from an engineering perspective, we tend to work with a fixed set of rules or requirements in very stable environments with a stable kind of structured work style. So these things naturally are at conflict with each other. And to better understand that, in the next slide, we'll kind of take that a turn deeper. So when we think about privacy rights versus engineering principle, there's really 4 key areas where there's conflict. And a lot of that conflict stems from the fact that privacy professionals really don't understand engineering principles and processes, and vice versa. Traditionally, engineering folk really don't necessarily have a solid understanding of privacy rules, regulations, principles, and rights. And that foundational lack of understanding of kind of the cross-functional disciplines are really where a lot of that conflict resides. And in order to build privacy engineering at scale, being able to, one, identify that those conflicts exist, and two, look at approaches that we can take to really address those conflicts are some of the first steps that we can take to having privacy engineering at scale. So the first area, the first of four, is this notion of data minimization versus kind of this big data approach. So from a privacy rights perspective, you'll see a lot of focus on not only minimizing the data that we collect, specifically the personal information that we collect, as a core principle, but is also minimizing the use of that data. So how that data is being used, analyzed, shared internally and externally, and also minimizing the time in which we actually retain that data. Conversely, from an engineering perspective, traditionally, we've always taken this big data approach where the goal is to maximize the collection of data to support analytics initiatives. More recently, you're seeing the usage of machine learning and AI technologies to further analyze, enrich, and enhance that data. In a lot of cases, from an engineering perspective, we take we're going to collect the data using a just-in-case approach, or additionally, having larger and larger data sets allows us to remove biased outcomes that result from the analysis of that data. So you have this initial conflict between data minimization and big data approaches. Similarly, you'll have, as a second area of conflict, this conflict between purpose limitation and the notion of collecting it all. So purpose limitation is exactly what it sounds like, which is you should limit the data that you collect to the purpose for which you're collecting it. So a practical example of that is, if I'm doing a monthly email newsletter, I don't need to collect Robert's physical address or his phone number because I'm simply emailing a newsletter out using his email address. From an engineering perspective, again, similar to the big data concept, the general posture is, hey, let's collect as much information as possible so that we can support internal processes, analysis that we're potentially doing, correlating that data with other data that we might have collected through different means for the purposes of enrichment of that data. The third one is interesting as well, which is this notion of right to explanation, which is somewhat of a controversial topic within the EU GDPR legislation, which is this notion that data should really only be collected or data should be excluded from solely being processed via automated means where there's no human in the loop, if you will. And that covers both processing for decision-making as well as profiling of individuals. Conversely, from an engineering perspective, you have a lot of these black box algorithms that are in play that, one, are difficult to explain in a meaningful way to a consumer where they can make informed decisions. And a lot of those black box algorithms are core to some of the primary business processes that an organization needs to support. So you have this massive collection of data, a lot of it personally identifiable information being processed by algorithms that are often difficult to explain to a consumer so they can make informed decisions. And I think further complicating that is, again, the increased use of machine learning and AI technologies that make it even more difficult to explain what those algorithms are really doing underneath the covers. And then lastly, you have this area of data portability versus data as an asset. And under a lot of the privacy rights, you have this notion that your data should be portable, it should be accessible by an individual, versus the historical posture that, hey, the data that we've collected is an asset to the organization. And that creates some problems, especially in the way of agreed upon schemas for different types of data, security for which, or how that data is shared potentially between organizations, and challenges where, my data, for example, might also include information about other secondary data subjects. Next slide. So in order to deal with a lot of those conflicts, you're seeing more and more push for privacy by design. And in the interest of time, I'll touch on some of these concepts. There are 7 core principles around privacy by design, but the general idea is that we're injecting privacy considerations very early on in the design process for a lot of these systems and business processes that are ultimately responsible for collecting privacy information, processing it, storing it, and sharing it. And so within those core principles, the first one is this proactive versus reactive approach. So very much like the security space, privacy tends to initially take more of a reactive posture in most organizations. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the privacy maturity curve. Privacy by design calls for being more proactive, which requires organizations to understand the value of privacy, making a commitment to consumer privacy and establishing processes early on. The second is privacy as a default setting, which is really the goal of an organization should be to provide the maximum degree of privacy by default, rather than providing privacy as some obscure set of options that are often obfuscated from the consumer. The third is privacy embedded in the design. Again, this should occur from the onset of a new system or process, that privacy should be built in from the get-go. Obviously, this can be a little bit challenging as we're dealing with a lot of historical systems that have been in place for quite a long time where privacy wasn't necessarily considered in the initial design. So you're having to go back and retrofit and make adjustments after the fact. But going forward, embedding privacy in the design of any new systems is a core concept of privacy by design. The fourth is avoiding some of the false dichotomies that start to emerge when we start thinking about privacy. It's a natural reaction to think that you have these dichotomies that are privacy versus revenue or privacy versus security. The reality is, when designed properly, privacy should result in a win-win proposition for both the business and the consumer. The fifth is full lifecycle protection. No surprise here that from the point of collection of personal information through the processing, sharing, and ultimate retention and disposition, we should be considering the privacy of the consumer as a core concept here. The sixth is visibility and transparency. And this really comes down to assurance to all the stakeholders involved that business processes and technologies that are involved in the collection and processing of privacy information, that those systems and processes are in fact operating based on their stated intentions, their stated premises, purposes, and objectives. And this also potentially should be verifiable by third parties, which is, one of the challenges that we'll talk about here shortly as well. And lastly is the user-centric approach. No surprise here that putting the user first and done through strong privacy defaults, appropriate notices and user-friendly options is massively critical to implementing a privacy by design program and ultimately being able to engineer privacy at scale. Next slide, please. So ultimately what emerges are really a technology stack that supports a variety of areas of privacy programs within an organization. And those cover really 4 different areas. Consumer trust, which is something that Robert touched on. Obviously, building consumer trust and brand reputation are massively critical to this ongoing success of an organization. Being a good steward of an individual's privacy information is critical. Privacy operations, as we've seen emerge, there are privacy is ultimately owned by privacy operations groups that tend to fall under legal. And there's a set of technology tools that are necessary for privacy operations to conduct their day-to-day business. That's ranging from being able to conduct assessments, audit different systems and processes, start to implement standard processes, including things like privacy by design, start to assess the risk of different IT systems and processes within an organization. Business enablement, which really focuses on a set of guidelines and principles that allow or accommodate the use of data in conjunction with dynamic consumer preferences. So this is a combination of enabling the business to be able to use data that you're collecting in a way that has been agreed upon or consented to by individuals for whose data you've collected. And then lastly, you have data management, which is this process within your organization of being able to discover, map, catalog, and classify privacy data that's been collected by a variety of different systems, both internal as well as vendor-based systems in your organization that are in use in your organization today. Next slide. So I want to touch real quickly on a use case where this is a set of where this particular organization had a set of challenges that are pretty consistent with what we see in the privacy space. In this case, it was a large educational technology organization or ed tech organization that had sensitive data on millions and millions of students, personal employee data, leveraged hundreds of third-party vendor applications, and had to deal with fragmented systems due to a lot of M&A activity. Ultimately, by acknowledging a lot of the challenges and conflict between privacy and engineering, they implemented a set of solutions that established a central hub for privacy data and policies, started to build privacy requirements into their product development cycle or the engineering process, established frameworks or step-by-step frameworks for ensuring privacy compliance, including assessing the variety of systems that they had in play, and then beginning to automatically classify the data in real time to get a view of the risk. And ultimately, the benefit was being able to reduce the data privacy risk overall, which obviously deals with reducing risk from fines and penalties associated with violations, as well as building brand reputation within the organization, and ultimately leveraging that brand reputation as a result of being a good steward of privacy data as a differentiator in the market. Next slide, please. So I'll touch real quickly on this privacy maturity curve concept. You know, based on the polls, you can see that a lot of organizations are really in that kind of middle ground, starting with ad hoc and implementing more repeatable and defined processes. But a lot of that is still very much a reactive posture. So if you think about some of these ad hoc solutions for addressing responding to data subject requests where a consumer submits an access request to view the data that you might have on a given individual. From a privacy operations perspective, you're conducting privacy impact assessments on existing business processes and supporting IT systems. You know, a lot of organizations are just starting at that point with the goal of working towards more of a proactive posture where you have insights into systems and processes that are collecting certain types of data, and then understanding the impact of an ever-changing regulatory landscape across different geographies with regard to privacy data. So the goal here is for organizations to continue and you know, don't feel overwhelmed. Most organizations, as you can see, are on the left-hand side of the scale where we're really, or left-hand side of the curve where we're really in more of a reactive state. Ultimately, we're trying to work towards being more proactive with regard to privacy maturity, where we're proactively implementing processes, we're deploying privacy by design initiatives where we're building privacy into the initial design of an IT system or process, and really working towards more of that optimized state, which, you know, as Robert pointed out in a separate conversation that we have, is very difficult to do. It's sort of a lot, being fully optimized from a privacy perspective is going to take a lot of work. and a lot of effort to get to that point. So just some key takeaways to consider in terms of where to start. I think one of the most important aspects of being able to implement or engineer privacy at scale is for the respective parties, privacy professionals as well as engineering professionals, to pursue some of that cross-discipline knowledge. So for engineers, start to educate yourself on privacy and privacy laws, and conversely for privacy professionals to start to engage with engineering to understand engineering processes. That's massively critical to get some of that cross-discipline knowledge and collaboration. Certainly don't wait to get started to mature privacy operations. Don't wait to start implementing procedures and processes, and focus constantly on how you can move from the left to the right of that privacy maturity curve. If your program is already up and running, look at where you land today and start setting goals and objectives and how to move kind of from the left to the right of that privacy maturity curve. And then ultimately embracing privacy by design principles are going to help accelerate your privacy programs and ultimately engineer privacy at scale. Next slide. So I'll hand it back to Robert for some closing thoughts.
Sure, thanks. I appreciate it, Trevor. And as I said at the very beginning, this is the first of 7 different webinars that we're going to co-sponsor and host with WireWheel, and we're deeply appreciative of WireWheel's time. As we go through these webinars, they'll get a little more complex and a little more what I'll call fun, executable, rather than having kind of the high-level umbrella type overview. A couple of things Trevor just mentioned, and when you talk about pursuing knowledge, as an example, the International Association of Privacy Professionals offers a number of certifications, such as Certified Information Privacy Professional US, Europe. They also offer a technology certification, CIPT. So if you sit in the technology side of the house, you might consider doing that. ISACA also runs multi-day privacy boot camps if you're interested in anything like that, and has ongoing privacy education, as does the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. So you can find the information all over the place. I would urge you to take a look at the IAPP website as well as others to gain some more information. The reality of what both I and Trevor have been talking about is organizational cultural change and embedding privacy in the foundational elements of what every single organization, individual does every single day. So we have some upcoming events. Next week, we have the Spokes Virtual Privacy Conference. You can sign up here. There are a number of companies, a number of leading privacy professionals who are involved in this particular conference. I'm on a panel on day 2. And I would urge you to consider signing up. It's a wonderful opportunity to hear from the best of the best. I'm not saying I fall in that category, but it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from the best of the best and to be a balance between regulation, regulators, technologists, and privacy professionals. Second up is our July webinar, which is I'm responsible for privacy, now what? And that can happen at the individual level or the organizational level. So it's not talking about you're leading it. You may be a local representative in your division who's responsible for privacy. So we are very interested in moving forward to talk about the responsibilities and the movement up that maturity curve. And then lastly is whether it be the Enthus Advyz team or the WireWheel team, we are happy to engage with any of you one-on-one and or group on group or together. And whether it be just to answer subject matter advisory type questions, whether it be to hold workshops, whether it be to conduct engagements, whether to learn more about our products and services, please feel free to reach out to any of us, the contact information at the beginning, or your Enthus 360 sales rep, or somebody such as Trevor, and we can get our teams locked and loaded to begin to help you out. One of the things I'm thrilled about is when we first came on, we hit 35 participants, went up to 39. We've held 32 to this particular time frame, and I'm just absolutely thrilled with that. So with that said, let's move over to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And if you don't, then I have one for Trevor and we'll wrap up. But let's get a hand raised or to ask some other questions. And I believe either Jasmine or Hafiza will take care of the Q&A for us.
Yeah, Robert, we don't have any questions just yet, so you could go ahead.
Oh, okay. So Trevor, you know, you've been around technology for a long time. I didn't need to stress the word long quite so hard, but you've been around technology for a long time. What has been the core driver from your perspective where technology began to take a leading role with privacy? When I began my life as a privacy officer, I went in and told the CISO he had to start encrypting all of the portable devices. And he told me to take a hike because encryption was 2 years down the road on his roadmap. So what do you see as the core driver of why technology is now taking a leading role? One that I see is their expertise in project management, but two, what's the movement from a functional perspective of why technology has become so important?
Well, I think there's probably a couple different ways to look at it. One, they're sort of, I don't want to say partly to, I guess that's probably the best way to say it. In a way, they're partly to blame for the privacy challenge that we have, right? So technology has always taken a leading role in sort of the collection and the use of privacy data, which has then triggered, I think, a lot of the awareness and then followed by legislation of some of the challenges that exist just around how invasive some of the technology can be. So I think naturally, because a lot of the systems that were previously developed are involved in the collection, processing, storage, sharing of a lot of the data, that they, of course, are going to be on the forefront of figuring out how to address the problem and address the problem in a way that's mutually beneficial to both the consumer and the business. So I think that has a lot to do with it. You know, certainly it's a technology-driven world, so there's a lot of ways in which we can get creative to help, you know, solve the problems with technology as well. You know, and as we look at, you know, ways that we move from more of a reactive posture where we're using systems to automatically assess or generate privacy impact assessments, for example, or respond to a data subject request and fulfill it automatically. Certainly some great ways that technology can help, you know, fit the bill and fill that role and reduce the dependency on a lot of the manual operations and people involved in those processes. I think ultimately, you know, technology is going to become the solution to the problem as we work back towards the design phase and integrating into things like continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines as a way to identify where systems are evolving and changing their posture in terms of how they're collecting, gathering, and processing privacy information as well. So I look at it two ways. One, privacy has sort of helped create the problem. Therefore, they're responsible in a way for fixing it, but there's also a lot of technology tools that can be used to help automate what is often very manual processes and assessing risk and determining corrective actions or remediation as a result of privacy legislation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll just add in that the number of CIOs, CISOs, CTOs who are reaching out from a privacy program execution perspective, particularly of late, as they see risk and whether it be risk of breach, risk of operations, or need of technology, has significantly increased over the last 3 years. So I appreciate the explanation. Hafiza, do we have anything else?
We don't actually, and I think we're at the end of the hour, so we should probably let folks go.
Yep, I agree. So is there anything you'd like to wrap up with, ma'am?
No, I think you covered it. So we look forward to seeing you all over the course of the series, over the course of the next several months. So please watch your email for that invite to come shortly.
Thank you all for attending.